we have half an hour for general discussion. The floor is open. 1, 2, for the 3. Okay? Please, Anna Marta.
Yes, thank you, Janne, for the presentation, which is very clear. I was thinking of populism. I think it's clear that populism is a child of resentment. And it's itself a reflection of our present emotional culture. Now, this emotional culture has complex roots. It has developed out of certain structural changes and cultural changes, and it can be reversed only through similar cultural changes and structural changes. You have pointed out the importance of teaching, for instance, the history of philosophy. This is really interesting because one of the problems we have to confront is the fact that emotional culture doesn't allow for deep reflections. So this is something interesting to deal with. But on the other hand, we have the structural side of the coin, which is developing some agency at the meso level, as Lasega has pointed out, and also Margaret in her paper. Now, the point is that there are many people throughout the world that nowadays are affected by global economic and political decisions, and they don't have a say in those political and economic decisions. On the other hand, it's been a long story here in the European Union, since Habermas first pointed out that there is a democratic deficit in the European Union because, well, we never felt it very representative in many respects. Now, I think that starting global alliances between NGOs and also the church and whatever, that can be a viable way to start really a bottom-up change that eventually can be heard at the political level. So I would like to hear your view on this topic. How realistic do you think this is? To me, it's more realistic than attempting change at the political level at the moment.
Yes, thank you. The emotionalism of perhaps modern media also, that it's, you know, I sometimes think people voted for Trump because they wanted to identify with somebody who really got very rich, who was successful, who speaks as simplistically as I do, or as they do. Sort of, here is a guy who speaks like me, and I'm a working class guy from sort of somewhere in America, and I am not successful, but he is very successful, and he is a bit like me. Also the TV medium, we know that what you say on TV is not very important. People remember maybe one slogan, one simple message, but how you look, whether they like you, matters a lot, and there are ways of measuring this. And I would imagine that the internet is also very much, you can sort of live in your own world of which you like, and this is where you find. So this is the problem of being unable to, when one doesn't discuss ideology and think about politicians as film stars or idols or something like that. And ideology is the bulwark against this kind of superficiality, because if you have some grounding in the real differences in how you think the state and society and market should be organized, these are differences along the left-right spectrum. So I don't think the whole party structure, representative government and so on, and ultimately citizenship, voting rights, they make sense only when ideology is the major factor, not persons, not sort of idiosyncratic facts. And how one can get back to ideologically based politics, I don't know. I mean, it's a major problem. It's a cause of populism, but it's also a problem in the mainstream parties. They look very much alike. Everybody wants to be in the middle. Nobody wants to be a socialist anymore. Nobody wants to be conservative. Everybody is a sort of centrist, liberalist, centrist liberal type of trying to attract as many voters as possible. And about 40% of voters in our country change party each time they vote, every fourth year. And it used to be almost impossible to think of changing party in your lifetime. You know, you would be an honest, sort of honest follower of one ideology. NGOs, solution. Well, there's a lot of potential, but there's also a lot of problem with, if we think about NGOs, we usually associate them with they are good, they do good things, which is very often the case. But if you think about how representative are NGOs as opposed to the power they may wield, small NGOs, what we call single issue interest groups, have, for instance, they are major proponents of change, be it something we like or do not like. But they are in themselves very often not very representative of the masses of many people. There's a study, Noel Neumann, or there's a study about...
Elizabeth Noel Neumann? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. She wrote a very important book about public opinion several years ago. Noel Neumann, Austrian. And she showed how just small groups could change public opinion on vital issues and in a way represent public opinion when they didn't really represent. So this is a double-edged sort of political way. If you have a massive mobilization via the internet, it can really be for some good cause and set an agenda, but it can equally well be for some cause that is not so desirable.
Thank you, Jan, for your rich paper. My attention was attracted on the legalization of politics, as you wrote on the slides. That is the growing influence of law power on politics as it is usual now in Europe and in Italy also. I am a bit worried about the functioning of European Human Rights Court in Strasbourg. And I would like to know your opinion about this kind of situation and about the hermeneutics or interpretation of Nice chart, especially Article 8 and 9, which are very deeply involved with the structure of family. Thank you.
Well, I don't know this in any detail, so I can't reply about exactly this one case. But in general, I mean, we are happy about human rights being promoted, and that there is a supranational court that can pass judgments on Russia, on sort of fundamental human rights that are often broken in many member states, violated. But there's something absolutely problematic about the method of this court, because I'm willing to accept a human rights court that I can trust to interpret basic human rights as I think common sense enlightened discussion will tell us should be the interpretation. One example where the court was wrong in its interpretation is religious freedom and the Lautsi case on Italy, which Joseph Weiler carried in the Grand Chamber when he was the leader of the Italian appeal in that case. Because the first ruling of the court then, of the lower chamber, was that it was a violation of religious freedom to have a crucifix on the wall in a public building. And then this was reversed by the Grand Chamber after a very, should one say, politically powerful process in Europe. So I think this is very disconcerting that the court is, if we trust it as a supranational court and we accept and implement its rulings, as Norway certainly does and most member states, there must be some as objective as possible method of interpretation.
Lukona. I want to ask a question around leadership. And my starting point is to say the fundamental assumption I've picked up whenever constitutions are enacted or governing rules are being enacted, they carry a very implicit assumption that at all times we will elect sober, rational, and well-committed leaders. Because the institutions of checks and balances are at the tail end of the process when the political process has produced the leaders. But now what I am noticing, and before I get to what I'm noticing, so at the tail end, and that tail end presupposes that for the checks and balances to be meaningful, they will be appealing to some morality, some moralness of leaders. So if amoral leaders are elected, those checks and balances are compromised because a person is being put to check, and because they don't have a sense of public morality, they ignore the check that is being put on them. Therefore, you lose the balance of using the check against mismanagement or misgovernance by a leader. What I am noticing now is an emergence of two things: rogue leaders and political syndicates, but they are produced by the democratic process, because it is actually very easy to hijack the democratic process, because democracy is like a simple random methodology. Everybody has a fair chance of being elected if they stand for that election. Now, my question is, do you think democratic states need to start thinking about screening leaders before they even appear on a ballot box? Of course, that could be saying you are circumventing the democratic process, but the reality is that people have seen that you can actually hijack democracies and are beginning to use that low barriers to entry as a mechanism to capture states and public opinions and all other things that absent eventually politics being about ideas and ideologies, as you say.
Thank you. Maybe I didn't quite get all of your question, but I think the difference between a Putin and a Trump, if one may allow this comparison, which is not quite fair, but sort of leaders that like to use power as they see fit, who are not used to observing what is proper to politics, the rules of procedure, etc., etc. The difference is, of course, that there is a check and balance system in the United States that is active at present. Not perfect, but it certainly functions. And the US is such a great democracy in these terms because it has this basic idea and the institutions of check and balance. So the courts enter into action. There is a rule of law by and large, grosso modo. So of course, the good. in a more ideal world, we wouldn't need the checks and balances. There would be the best persons elected, they would be morally to be trusted, etc. But since we deal with power in the ultimate degree, in a way, national politics, there is human nature to be reckoned with. But I also think the press will focus on persons' morality. I mean, one may be elected despite being of questionable integrity. Also Trump as an example. And this is perhaps very disconcerting because, you know, if one is elected then in a legal manner, in the correct procedural manner, then one is elected. It's the same as citizens with the vote. If they cast their vote to a populist party, we may deplore it, but we're not really entitled to say they are too stupid to have the vote. So democracy is not a perfect system, but there are very few alternatives.
I would like to continue this excellent question and connect it with what you have said, because I think it's a very, very important problem that you're addressing. Let me begin with a conceptual clarification. Your definition or use, you didn't explicitly offer a definition, but your use of democracy is one widespread use, namely democracy is understood as a system with universal suffrage and separation of powers, as well as the rule by and of law. That was the definition that you implied. However, it's very important to know that there have been completely different definitions of democracy, most famously by Carl Schmitt, for whom the democratic principle is simple, the rule by the majority. The liberal principle is all the other things, separation of powers, rule of law, etc. And Carl Schmitt does not claim in his famous Verfassungslehre, which is one of the best books about constitutional law ever written, he doesn't claim that the two principles are logically incompatible. He only claims that they are based on different principles, and therefore he famously argued when Adolf Hitler was elected, this is the triumph of democracy against liberalism. The democratic principle has triumphed over the liberal principle, because his concept of democracy doesn't entail separation of powers. It is an expression of the will of a majority to do what they want. Now, I do think that it is important to see that you can define terms like that, and it is obviously so that the understanding of the principle of separation of powers is intellectually much, much more demanding than understanding the principle of the rule of a person who gets a majority. And what I see happening in discourses, even with students at elite universities, is that they understand less and less the complex arguments for separation of powers. And forgive me if I say it against both you and Vittorio, we don't want to enter into a substantial matter, but I regard it as utterly dangerous to try to delegitimize the courts by pointing to some decisions which we may not disagree. The traditional argument that I always heard in older times from the radical left is, how can 8 men that form one of the 2 chambers of the German Constitutional Court dare to decide against what the majority of the population wants? And my answer was always, well, that's the whole principle of separation of powers. We want to have minority protected, and we believe that it's more likely that these minorities are protected by persons who are educated in the law than by popular outrage. So that is a very important point. And clearly Trump doesn't understand the principle of separation of power. He doesn't understand it. Therefore, the judges who want to stop him are traitors to the American people, etc., etc. That's when the language, and it's a democratic language, because he thinks he has this popular vote behind him. You know, the popular vote was rigged in America. That is also one of the alternative facts that we have been presented. There's never been so many people at the inauguration ceremony as under him. All these are interesting facts that he offers to his supporters, and judges are an enemy to that. So in this situation, the question of the self-destruction of democracy appears, and the question became very, very virulent in the 1920s and 30s. Germany was not the only country that legally abolished democracy. Never forget that in March of 1933, when Hitler passed the famous Enabling Act, in the same month, 2 other countries passed very similar acts, Austria and Poland. So it was a general principle of Central Europe to limit democracy in a constitutional way. Now, what did we learn in our Grundgesetz, in the Basic Law of Germany of 1949, that we forbid parties that explicitly want to abolish democracy. That was a big lesson of Hitler's ascent to power, and here Carl Schmitt, by the way, had been a genius, because in 1932 he publishes an essay, Legality and Legitimacy, in which he says, what we are now witnessing is that certain parties legally want to abolish the Weimar Constitution. And the Weimar Constitution was not protected against that, and Schmitt says this has to be prevented. Now, Germany is protected against parties that have deliberately the desire to overthrow it. What is much more dangerous is exactly what you say, that people take the cloak of a traditional party, which is much made easier by the fact that there are no clear ideologies anymore, and within the cloak of a traditional party, try to subvert basic principles of a constitution. And here I do think we have to look at the question how older cultures address the issue, even if it is not easy to render compatible with our general political philosophy. They come to an end. And the question is, ancient republics. Ancient republics. If you read this Constitution of the Athenians by Aristotle, you'll find out that every person who wanted to run for a public office, usually it was by election, was first put to scrutiny. If, for example, someone said this person did not care for his old parents and old age, there was no welfare at that time, he was out, he was disqualified. The censor in Rome that went through the Senate list and threw people out when they behaved in a certain way was a similar institution. I do think you are absolutely right. We must rethink about such an institution. Thank you for the proposal.
You can be the new censor of politicians then.
Plato the Elder.
Exactly. But the point is, the point about supranational courts is different because courts are not in a political vacuum. There is a need for some kind of check and balance system, which we don't have. Majority tyranny, which is what you talk about really, we see, of course, this in immature European democracies, Orban, the Poles, not willing to accept really minority positions, not seeking pluralism, but seeking acting as if winner takes all. So this is, and this, of course, has a lot of implications that we don't see in institutions, but because the formal institutions are there all the time. But when power is so important vis-à-vis rules and institutions, then you have a lot of self-censorship, a lot of bandwagoning and so on.
Thank you. Massimiliano. And finally, Maggie.
Thank you. I have some comment and a final question at the end. Sometimes when hearing about the European Union, it seems that is a body arrived from outside, actually, but something from the above. But actually, what the European Union is what has been created by its member states. It's nothing else. Yesterday, we were hearing the need of common policies regarding migrations, and we don't have a common policies regarding migrations. And the reason is that the majority of the member states oppose to have a common policies, as they oppose to have common policies regarding employment, for example. The first common framework in employment policies provided by the European Union was the Youth Guarantee. And in order to have the Youth Guarantee, the implementation of national plans were conditioned to the submission or to the access of funding. So it was putting this conditionality in the access of funding that convinced member states to propose these common policies of the Youth Guarantee. Because at the end, the powers that the European Union has in employment and social issues is quite limited, mainly is on the economic issues. Sometimes I think that there is a differences between a deficit in the feeling of representation through the definition of European Union a kind of a non-democratic body. I think that there is a big difference because Europeans vote for the European Parliament. The European Commission is chosen by the Council of the European Union, in which the head of the states of the European Union member states sits. So they are voted. There is not something that has not been voted by the European citizenship. You defined actually Norway a kind of a colonial state of the European Union. Norway asked to participate to the European Union in 1962, and the negotiation process ended in 1972, where in the parliament an overwhelming majority voted in favor of being part of the European Union. But then in the referendum following this vote, Norwegians voted against being part of the European Union. And the same happened then in 1994. So at the end, it's still a decision of people, what is the different relationship between, for example, Norway and the European Union. But of course, there is it's not a body that works perfectly, and this lack of feeling of representation is clear. But in terms of common policies and harmonization of policies, the only area where there is common policies is the coordinated policies is the economic one. And this follows the requirement in order to access to the third stage of the Maastricht Treaty, namely the European Monetary Union. And for this coordination never took place before the crisis. Then after the crisis, yes, there were the need of an addition of coordinations. And of course, we can discuss about the solutions found to exit from the crisis that were all but optimal, because after 8 years, we are not in a very good situation. But in many cases, many member states were angered by their own public debt. So they were, in order to respect the criteria of the monetary union, there were very little room to move. This because the access to the monetary union was, from the member states' position, unsustainable in order to, without having implemented several policies as a reform on labor market that could have increased the competitiveness of certain member states. But of course, this economic coordination was quite tough on member states, and many leaders of several member states refused to take their own responsibilities, but was more easy to accuse Brussels, for example, and if even though was not entirely true, but then true were the consequences. In fact, I mean, among the citizenship, of course, now there is a huge resentment against the European Union. Of course, several voters found that the democratic power reduced because whatever government they choose, at the end, the economic policies that they have to implement are limited, and so limited is the room of intervention.
Thank you.
And I drive to the question, actually. You mentioned the populism, of course, that in my opinion was born from this reduction of the democratic power. You mentioned that security is one of the need. The driver of the populism, you mentioned Putin, but many of the populistic movements actually receive money by Putin, and the voters are in favor of a strong man like Putin and not of a democratic body. And at some point they will go to government, because they will go. What do you think that will happen? Because they will be unable to deliver their promises. Will witch hunting start again as in the 6-7 years ago?
Thank you.
Well, that was a long comment. I think federalism as the main sort of theory that would conform to subsidiarity was the plan for the EU initially and ought to be implemented. I mean, this is a theory of decentralization, of political decentralization. And it is on the law books of the EU that one should observe subsidiarity, of course. But all institutions, be they national or international, tend to to increase their own power base if they can. If they have a budget, if they are vested interests everywhere. But the EU can either become federal, which I think it ought to attempt to do now, or it can be intergovernmental like any other international organization. Then it will not have the benefits of much common policy, because it will be really consensus-based more and more, I think. Your question, I believe that unless the mainstream parties, the responsible parties of Europe, really take all these challenges seriously now and face them, try to tackle them, then populist parties will continue to define their agenda through these issues. And that could be extremely dangerous, because clearly what you promise of economic output and so on, if you reduce politics to a renationalized Europe and you get all these small national policies of this or that, it's going to be catastrophic. There's no return to all these small states having very national policies on both economy, migration, and whatnot.
Thank you. Maggie. And you too, second time. Yes, we are run out of time. Anyway, please.
Sorry, I can pass if we really have.
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, it's a very quick question, and it's born out of my idleness. It's something I came across and didn't have a chance to check, but it struck me as odd. Namely, that the European Commission was considering conferring legal personhood on fabricated beings with artificial intelligence. So it's a double-barrel question. One, how did that actually get? Even it's only in draft form, as you doubtless know, but how did that even get onto the table? And secondly, is there no contradiction between discussing that with the possibility of a positive outcome and human rights law in general?
Thank you.
Well, Margaret, you have me there. Here's a question I can't reply to at all. I think I've heard about this debate, but I'm not sure whether it was in an EU context or another context, or the Strasbourg court, about the legal personhood to artificial persons. But the lawyers here in the room, maybe they have something to aid us here, because I don't really understand what it's about. It's a patent, perhaps, for legal representation of artificial intelligence, then.
Intelligence, I mean, it exists. It's attaching rights, and above all, the rights of personhood, to a clever machine. A machine which may indeed be capable of, eventually, normativity, judgment, even phronesis, who knows, but isn't yet. So it's this sort of advanced, progressive notion of, progressive used now purely in the sense that it's in advance of its time. How did this come about?
Well, there is a debate about drones, or not drones, but automatic weapon systems, as they are called, which are now possible to develop, that will be in drones. That will be so programmed that they are able to make decisions on when to fire the weapon and kill somebody, and thus then who is responsible when nobody makes that, no human being makes the decision. So this is a debate in terms of Geneva Conventions and so on. But beyond that, I'm not familiar with this, but perhaps the Americans are so advanced technologically.
Very briefly, because of course the concept of legal personhood is long and complex, affected by different systems of law. But what they all have in common, whether it's an ancient Roman collegium or an American corporation, is that the artificial person represents two or more other real minds. Okay. It's representative of two or more real minds, whether it's strict liability or limited liability. But here's the interesting thing. It's already happened, because a thinking machine that's programmed by two or more minds and is arguably more a single substance than a corporation, a legal corporation. It's going to happen. Because right now there is trading by corporate persons that's 99% of which is automatic by machine, representing all of their wills.
Thank you. So, Vittorio, you want to, and you are already out of time, but since I'm democratic, I leave to you. Please.
I would like to underline concerning the other Vittorio intervention. Microphone. Yeah. About one of the worst book by Carl Smith, State, Movement, and People, issued in 1935. The leading power, as Vittorio said, was attributed to the movement, Bewegung, but the movement was only the Führer principle. All this, that is very clear and important, has nothing to do with the question about Strasbourg Court and its interpretation of Human Rights Convention, the Human Rights Convention of 1950. My question is it possible an interpretation of this convention which seems completely different and opposite in respect of the text and the words of this convention of 1950? This is a different question. I agree with the other Vittorio about the difference, the deep difference between liberal democracy and the foreign strange idea of democracy passed out by Smith. But my question was different, and the problem is the growing influence of juridical law power about politics.
Okay. Thank you. You want to add something?
Yes, I know exactly what you talk about. If one said in 1950 what is a family, or what does it consist, how to define a family, then it would be man, woman, and children. If you say today what is a family, then the answer is in many European states, well, it's regardless of sex, it's two persons who decide to marry and so on. So this is the whole difference. If it is unsatisfactory from a democratic point of view that somebody will make these decisions supranationally if they are political decisions. If they are legal interpretations of legal principles of human rights, that we have a sort of objective definition of something that is a permanent sort of understanding, right to life or not right to euthanasia, whatever these fundamental human rights, if we have a clear understanding of what they entail, and they are human rights and not political products, then we accept the supranational court, and we need a supranational court. So this is the sort of the issue, and I think the method of this dynamic method is in a way by itself unacceptable, because it just says that human rights represent political trends. And if you say that to the Chinese, they will probably agree, yes, it's all positive law. Chinese human rights are different than,
Yes.
than others' human rights. But this is not what we mean by human rights.
Okay, thank you.